The dog had not eaten in 9 days. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Not the empty chair at the dinner table. Not the small pair of rubber boots still sitting by the front door with mud dried into the treads. Not the half-finished drawing on the kitchen counter. A blue crayon horse with a name written underneath it in uneven, determined letters. The dog had stopped eating, and somehow that single fact cut through everything else in a way that the investigators' voices and the neighbor casseroles and the grief counselor's pamphlets could not. His name was Shepherd. He was a blue heeler mix, broad through the chest, with one ear that stood straight and one that folded over at the tip, and he had been Caden's dog from the first day they brought him home as a puppy 4 years earlier. He had slept at the foot of Caden's bed every night since. He had waited at the end of the driveway every afternoon at the same time, watching the road, and when the school bus pulled around the corner, his whole body would shake with something that looked less like excitement and more like relief. Now Shepherd sat at the window that faced the back field. He sat there for hours at a time, motionless, watching the tree line where the property ended and that county forest began. He would not eat from his bowl. He would drink water if Merritt set it in front of him, but even then he kept his eyes on that window, kept something in his body oriented toward the trees, like a compass needle that had found its north. Merritt tried everything. Different food, a different bowl. He tried hand-feeding him, crouching on the kitchen floor and holding kibble in his palm the way you do with a sick animal, the way you do when you are desperate for something. To eat because watching something refuse to live is sometimes harder than the loss itself. Shepherd would look at his hand. He would look at him with those pale amber eyes. And then he would look back at the window. What Merritt did not know in those first raw weeks was that this was only the beginning. He did not know that Shepherd would keep sitting at that window every single evening at the same time for 11 years. And he did not know that the answer to why the dog was waiting would arrive at his front door on a Tuesday evening in October, carried by a young man with his son's eyes and a song he had never been taught. But all of that was still 11 years away. For now, Merritt just stood in his kitchen and watched his dog watch the trees, and the house was so quiet he could hear the clock on the wall, and outside, somewhere in the distance, a crow called once and then went silent. That was 6 days after Caden disappeared. The disappearance had happened on a Sunday, which felt important to Merritt in the first weeks, as if the day of the week meant something, as if God or chance or whatever ran the machinery of the world had been careless or deliberate in choosing a Sunday. Caden had been 7 years old. He had gone out after lunch to play in the backfield, which was something he did every weekend, something so ordinary and repeated and safe that Merritt had not watched him go. He had been washing dishes. He had been listening to the radio. He had looked up once through the kitchen window and seen the small shape of his son in the yellow afternoon light, moving toward the old fence line, a stick in his hand. When he looked again, 20 minutes later, the field was empty. He had gone out calling. He had called Caden's name across the field, the way you call with full confidence the first time, certain the child has just wandered behind the shed or into the wood line for a minute, certain the answer will come back like it always does. And when the answer didn't come, he had called again, different this time, the word gaining an edge that changed its shape, and Shepherd had come out of the house without being summoned and stood beside him in the field, and the dog's posture told him what his mind was still refusing to accept. Shepherd moved to the edge of the property where the fence met the forest. He stood there. He did not go in. He stood at the threshold and looked back at Merritt with his amber eyes and made a sound that was not a bark, not a whine, something lower, something that started in the chest and didn't have a name. Merritt called the sheriff's department at 4:20 in the afternoon. They searched for 3 days. Sheriff's department, volunteers, 2 search dogs brought in from the county seat, A helicopter that flew low over the tree line on the first afternoon and found nothing but birdsong and shadow. The county forest behind the property was large and dense and crossed by a creek that ran fast in October. People said things to Merritt that were meant to be kind. He could not hear most of them. He could only hear the creak in his mind, the sound of fast water, the way water sounds when it is running over rocks in the cold and will not stop. He had been raising Caden alone for 3 years at that point. Caden's mother, a woman named Petra, had left when the boy was 4, not abruptly and not cruelly, but with the particular determination of someone who has identified a life they need to be living and cannot delay any longer. She had gone to Portland, then to Vancouver, and the distance had gradually clarified itself into something permanent that they had never formally named, but both understood. They had managed things well for Caden's sake, phone calls and visits and birthday packages, and Merritt had told himself for years that this arrangement was fine, that it was manageable, that it was only the 3 of them living in different configurations of the same story. After Caden disappeared, Petra flew back. She stayed for 2 weeks. She and Merritt sat across from each other at the kitchen table many nights, and mostly didn't speak, and Shepard lay on the floor between them, as if he understood the geography of grief and was trying to cover as much of it as one dog could. When she left again, Merritt walked her to a rental car, and they stood in the driveway, and she held his hands for a long moment without speaking, and then she drove away, and he went back inside. He called her every few months for the first 2 years, then less often, not because the grief faded, but because grief, he had found, is not something that 2 people can carry together unless they are already very close to the same place, and he and Petra were not. They were in the same story, but in different rooms of it, and the rooms did not connect. After the search team stood down, after the investigators moved from urgent to procedural, after the neighbors stopped leaving food and started leaving space, Merritt remained. He and Shepard, and the empty house, and the mud-caked boots by the door. He kept the boots there. He was not ready to move them. He told himself he would know when he was ready, and 3 weeks passed, and then 3 months, and the boots stayed. He kept other things too. The blue crayon drawing on the kitchen counter, the horse with the name underneath. He had put it in a drawer after the first month, because he could not look at it, and he could not throw it away. He kept the 2 library books Caden had checked out the week before he disappeared, and when the library sent notices, he went in and explained, and the librarian, a woman who had been there for 20 years and knew every family in the district, had taken the notices off her screen and said nothing, and that had been one of the kindest things anyone did for him that year. He kept Shepard. Shepard stayed too, and every evening at 6:47, the dog would walk to the window that faced the backfield and sit down and watch the tree line until it was too dark to see. Merritt noticed the time after about a week. He was not a man who looked for patterns in pain. He had been a high school shop teacher for 14 years, a practical person, someone who believed in what could be measured and built and fixed. He did not believe in signs. But he began to notice that the dog moved to the window at the same time every night with the same settled, deliberate quality that a person moves to a pew in a church they have attended all their life, not compelled, chosen. 6:47. He looked it up once later. He found nothing useful. No sunset time, no astronomical significance, no anniversary he could locate. The time had no meaning he could find. Just a number. Just a time his son's dog had decided mattered, and kept on deciding mattered day after day, the way a compass doesn't decide to point north, but simply does. The first year was the hardest. This is not a surprising thing to say, and yet there is something almost dishonest in summarizing grief at that scale as simply the hardest, because hardest implies a comparison, implies something easier exists, and for Merritt, There was a long stretch in the middle of that first year when nothing in his life felt like it existed on a scale of hard and easy at all. He functioned. He went back to teaching in January because the alternative was worse. He graded projects and explained joint angles and watched 17-year-olds argue about wood grain and tried not to think about the fact that Caden had been 7 and would have been 8 by now and would have started losing his second set of teeth. He thought about it anyway. He thought about it every day. He thought about it in the particular way that parents think about lost children, which is not like thinking about the past at all, but like tracking a parallel present, a second life running alongside the one you are actually living, the life where the boy is growing and changing and you are watching it happen. Caden at 8, Caden at 9, Caden losing teeth and gaining opinions and outgrowing shoes. He ran this parallel track in his head with a consistency that frightened him a little, and that he never told anyone about because he was not sure, for a long time, whether it was grief or something that looked like grief but functioned more like hope. Shepard's vigil continued. This was the word Merritt eventually settled on privately in his own mind. Vigil, not waiting, which implied expectation, not mourning, which implied acceptance. Vigil, which implied both at once, which implied something still unresolved, still in the process of being held. The vet could not find anything wrong with him. This was the 4th month after Caden disappeared, when Merritt finally took Shepard in for a full examination because the dog had gone thin and the not eating had settled into a modified version of itself where Shepard would eat just enough to sustain himself and no more, as if he had calculated the precise minimum and refused to exceed it. The vet, a careful woman named Dr. Fielding, who had been practicing in that county for 20 years, ran blood panels and pressed her hands along the dog's ribs and shone a light in his eyes and found nothing physiologically wrong with him. She said sometimes animals grieve. She said it the way people say things they believe but cannot prove, which is a particular kind of courage Merritt had learned to recognize and respect. He asked her how long it lasted. She told him she had seen dogs grieve for months. She had seen it last longer than that. She did not say she had seen it last 11 years. But then, she had never seen a case quite like this one. Because it was not just that Shepard grieved. Many animals grieve. What made Shepard different, what Merritt came to understand slowly over the years, was the precision of it, the 647, the unwavering direction, the way the dog's body, in the final minutes before that time, would shift and orient and grow still, the way a person grows still when they are listening for a sound they cannot quite hear yet, but know is coming. 3 years in, Merritt started sitting with him. He was not sure why exactly. He told himself it was because the dog needed company, but that was only partly true. The fuller truth was that the vigil had become the only part of his day that felt honest. Everything else had a performed quality to it, the teaching and the grocery shopping and the phone calls with his sister in Ohio, who worried about him at specific intervals. But 647 at the window with Shepard felt like being exactly where he was supposed to be. Not healed, not recovered, just present in the right place at the right time. He would sit in the wooden chair he had moved from the dining room, and Shepard would sit beside him, and they would both watch the tree line until the dark came, and then Merritt would get up and turn on the kitchen light, and the evening would fold into itself and disappear. He never told anyone about this. He tried once with Zola. She was a family services coordinator who had worked with him in the first year after Caden's disappearance, one of several professionals who cycled through his life in that period. But she was different from the others in that she seemed to genuinely believe that the machinery of official help could accomplish something and also seemed aware of its limits. She had stayed in touch in a professional way that had, over years, become something closer to a careful friendship. She called on birthdays, on Caden's birthday especially, and she did not try to make those calls shorter than they needed to be. When Merritt told her about the 647, she was quiet for a moment. She asked him what he thought it meant. He said he had no idea. He said the dog had better information than he did. She laughed a little because she understood what he was not saying, which was that he found this credible. That after 6 years of watching, he had stopped looking for an explanation and started simply trusting the vigil in the way you trust something you cannot understand but cannot bring yourself to dismiss. He said, "If Shepard is still watching, I'll keep watching with him." She said, "Okay." There were investigators who came back periodically with updates that were not really updates. Cold case reviews. New databases cross-referenced against old records. Twice, there were individuals from other counties who matched certain parameters. And both times, the matching dissolved into nothing when examined closely. The first time this happened, Merritt had allowed himself to feel something that he later identified as the specific pain of almost, which is a different kind of pain from the original loss. Sharper in some ways, because it knows exactly what it is reaching for, and knows exactly when it fails to reach it. He had stood in his driveway for an hour after the investigator's call, in the cold, just standing. Shepard had come outside and sat beside him. After the second almost, Merritt had been more careful. He had learned to hold information at a distance until it proved itself real. He had learned that the hope that surges up in those moments is not a defect, but it is also not a resource that regenerates quickly, and he had to spend it carefully. He kept the case file the investigators had given him early on, a manila envelope fat with paper, in the drawer of the desk in the second bedroom. He looked at it sometimes. He did not read it. He just opened the drawer and let its presence remind him that the question was still open, that the machinery of the world had not yet issued a final verdict. Shepard's vigil continued. Year 7, Year 8, Year 9. The dog aged the way blue heelers age, slowly and then quickly, his muzzle going white, his eyes developing a cloudiness at the edges that Dr. Fielding monitored closely. He moved more carefully. He slept longer. His joints ached on cold mornings, and Merritt had started putting a folded blanket on the kitchen floor for him because Shepard had stopped making it up the 3 steps to the porch without hesitation. He was old. He was visibly old in the way that only becomes visible after years of not wanting to see it. But at 6:47, he walked to the window. Merritt once timed it with his phone, out of a kind of wondering disbelief. He watched the dog sleeping on the blanket across the room, deeply asleep, the chest rising and falling with that slow meditative rhythm. And then at 6:45 he watched Shepard's eyes open, not with a start, not from a noise. The eyes simply opened, measured and sure, and the dog stood slowly, giving his hips time to cooperate, and walked to the window and sat down. He had not set an alarm. There was no knock, no creak, no sound Merritt could identify that might have woken him. There was only the dog's internal architecture, whatever mechanism knew the time, whatever compass needle had been spinning in his chest for 9 years and still, reliably, found its direction. Merritt turned 52. He was still teaching. He had changed his curriculum 3 times in 11 years, adapting to new safety standards, new tools, new students who arrived with different reference points for what was useful in the world. He had become, in the way people become things slowly without noticing, a good teacher, not because he was particularly warm or particularly creative, but because he was present. His students felt that he meant what he said. He had the quality of someone who had learned the hard way that distraction was expensive. He had not remarried. He had not wanted to. He told Zola once, in the second year, that he felt he was waiting for something, and she had asked gently if he meant Caden, and he had said no or not only. He said he didn't know what he was waiting for. He said maybe the dog had that right too, that some things you wait for without knowing exactly what the waiting is for, and you just have to keep showing up. Zola had said that sounded like faith. He had said he wasn't sure. He had said maybe the difference between faith and stubbornness was just the outcome. He was 55 when the stranger came to his door. It was October. It was a Tuesday evening, and Merritt had come home from school and changed out of his work clothes and was standing in the kitchen making coffee when he heard the car in the driveway. He was not expecting anyone. He set down his cup. Through the kitchen window, he could see the last light on the back field, the tree line going dark at its edges, the grass still yellowed from the dry summer and moving a little in the October wind. Shepard was already moving toward the front door. This was wrong. Not alarming, not threatening, but wrong in the specific way that a change in a long-established pattern is wrong. The way a word mispronounced after years of being said correctly stops you mid-sentence. The dog went to the window in the evenings. He did not go to the door. He had not gone to the door in a voluntary and purposeful way in years, not unless Merritt was already there, or unless there was a clear and practical reason, a person he knew, a sound he recognized. He was going to the door now with a quality that had no name. He was not barking. He was not anxious. He stood at the door with his nose at the crack and something in his posture that Merritt had never seen before, something that was not alertness and was not threat, but was a kind of stillness, so complete it looked like held breath. Merritt opened the door. The young man standing on the porch was approximately 18 years old. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped dark hair and hands that hung at his sides with a slightly awkward quality of someone who is not sure whether to extend them or not. He was wearing a dark jacket that looked too thin for the October air, and he had a backpack over one shoulder. He had been crying recently, or had been trying not to. His eyes were swollen at the edges in the way that eyes get when they have been working hard at something painful for a very long time. Not for hours, but for months. The accumulated pressure of a truth that has been sitting at the back of the throat, waiting for a moment that was ready to receive it. He looked at Merritt. He looked at the dog. Something happened to his face. It was not a smile. It was not recognition in the conventional sense. It was something deeper than recognition, something that bypassed the part of the face that performs emotion and went straight to the part that simply responds, the part that the body controls rather than the mind. His mouth opened slightly. His hands came up in front of him, not extended toward Merritt, but toward the dog, curved slightly, the way you hold your hands when you are not sure if what you are reaching for is real. Shepard walked forward and pressed his head against the young man's hands. That was all. The dog did not bark. He did not jump. He did not perform the elaborate greeting ritual that dogs perform for strangers, and for loved ones, and for everyone in between. He simply walked forward and pressed the top of his white-muzzled head into the young man's palms and stood there. And the young man's hands closed around the dog's ears, one straight ear and one that folded over at the tip, and he held on. Merritt could not speak. The young man said, "I don't know if you remember me." He said it in a voice that was trying to be steady and was not quite managing it. He said his name was Fletcher, which was the name he had been given by the family who had raised him, and that his real name, his first name, was a thing he had not known until 3 months ago, when his adoptive parents finally gave him the records he had been asking for since he was 15. He said his real name was Caden. Merritt put his hand on the doorframe. He would not remember later whether he sat down or stayed standing. He would not remember exactly what words came out in what order. What he would remember was Shepard, who had not moved, who was still standing with his head pressed against the young man's hands, and the time on the clock on the wall behind him, which he could see from where he stood. 6:47. Caden had been taken on that Sunday afternoon 11 years ago by a man who had left the county forest through the far trailhead, 6 miles north, a man who had a history of fracture and desperation and who had believed in the catastrophic logic of people who are falling apart, that taking a child could fix something in himself that was already beyond fixing. He had driven north. He had ended up in a different state, a different set of circumstances, a motel room, and then a rented room, and then another motel, the geography of avoidance that people without plans eventually trace. He had not been violent. This was the thing that Merritt had to sit with for years, the thing that made the story stranger and harder to assign meaning to, the fact that the man who took his son had not hurt him in the ways that investigators first fear, had instead been erratic and frightened, and ultimately incapable of sustaining even the fantasy he had constructed. He had collapsed 4 months later in a parking lot in a small city. A medical episode brought on by circumstances the investigators described in terms that reduced a human failure to a clinical summary. And Caden, who had been kept in a situation that was never violent but was profoundly wrong, had been taken by emergency services and placed with a family services worker. The worker had processed the case through an already overwhelmed system. Somewhere in that processing, a records error had occurred, not malicious, not deliberate. The kind of error that happens when systems are built for volume and not for the one case that falls sideways through the cracks. A crossed file, a misread county code, a case number that mapped it to a different jurisdiction's database, a different state's intake records, an address field that pointed nowhere, and a family that had never been contacted. Caden's file had not been lost. It had been misfiled. And in the space between where the file should have been and where it actually was, 11 years had grown. The family who took him in were good people. They were not told the full history because the full history was contained in a file that had been misfiled. And what they were told was a shorter version that left out the address in the county where a father and a dog were sitting at a window every evening at 6:47. They called him Fletcher because he had not responded to Caden for weeks, because a child psychologist had suggested that a fresh name might help him build a sense of safety in his new circumstances. He had not been told this logic at the time. He had been 4 years old, young enough that memory moves strangely, that the line between what happened and what the body simply knows it carries is not always clear. He grew up in a house with good light and 2 older adoptive siblings, and a family that celebrated birthdays and took photographs and went to school concerts. He grew up knowing he was adopted, knowing something had happened before the beginning of his memory, but not knowing what. The not knowing was a kind of weather he had learned to live inside. He had friends who understood this about him, and friends who did not. He had a mother who would sit with him when the not knowing got loud and would not try to make it quieter than it was, and that had been a kind of grace. He had started pressing for records when he was 15. His adoptive parents had given him what they had, which was not much. The full file had taken 3 more years and 2 different legal processes and 1 attorney who worked with adoptees on records access as a volunteer project, and who had, on the day the file finally arrived, called him personally to say she hoped it gave him something useful. He had sat with the sealed envelope for 3 weeks on the desk in his room. He had moved it twice. He had put it in a drawer and taken it out again. He had understood in those 3 weeks that there was a version of his life before the envelope and a version after it, and that once he crossed that line, he could not cross back, and that he was not entirely sure he was ready, and also entirely sure that ready was not going to arrive by waiting for it. He opened it on a Sunday evening. Inside was a photograph. It was a photograph from the county sheriff's record. A family photograph that had been included in the original missing child documentation. The kind of photograph that is distributed to precincts and school districts. The kind that appears on flyers. A man and a small boy standing in front of a yellow house with a field behind it, and at the boy's feet, leaning against his leg with that folded ear and that steady amber gaze, a blue healer mix with a name tag on his collar. Fletcher, who was Caden, had not known the dog's name from the photograph. He had not been able to read the tag from the photograph's resolution. He had only known the dog. He had known him the way the body knows things the mind cannot access. The way hands reach before the mind decides to reach. The way a word sounds familiar before you know why you know it. He had looked at the photograph for a long time, an hour longer, sitting in the same chair at the same desk, where the envelope had waited 3 weeks, and something in him that had been formless and wordless and constant for 18 years had suddenly had a shape. He had looked at the man standing with the boy. He had looked at the field. He had looked at the dog's ear, the one that folded. And then he had closed the file, carefully, and he had sat in the dark for a while, and then he had gone to find his adoptive mother, who was in the kitchen, and he had handed her the photograph without saying anything. And she had looked at it for a long time too, and then she had put her hand over her mouth, and then she had put her arms around him. He had driven 14 hours to get here. He had knocked on the door at 6:47. He had not planned the time. He had simply driven until he arrived, stopping once for gas and once because he needed to pull off the road and sit with his hands on the wheel for a while. And he had arrived when he arrived, which was 6:47 on a Tuesday evening in October. There are things that cannot be accounted for. Merritt had spent 11 years knowing this, had spent 11 years sitting beside a dog who knew it better than he did. He had stopped needing the accounting. He had stopped needing the explanation. What he needed was standing on his porch. They sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night. Merritt made coffee and then forgot to drink it. Shepard lay between their chairs. They went through the file together, the photographs, the documents, and Merritt found himself looking at the face of the small boy in the photographs, and then looking at the face of the young man. Across the table and tracing the line between them, the way you trace a scar after it has healed, following the path of the damage to understand the shape of what survived. Caden, Fletcher, whoever he was in that moment, asked questions that Merritt answered as plainly as he could. What the day had been like, what had happened after, what the house had been like in the years since. He answered carefully and honestly, and without trying to make any of it into something other than what it was. When he asked about the dog, Merritt told him everything. The 9 days without eating, the 6:47, the 11 years. He laid it out plainly, the way you lay out a set of evidence to someone you trust to interpret it correctly. And the young man across the table listened without interrupting. When Merritt finished, he was quiet for a while. He looked at Shepard, who was watching him. He said, "I used to dream about a dog. I couldn't see the dog clearly in the dream. I just knew it was waiting. I had that dream for years. I thought I made it up." He said it with the particular quality of someone who has been carrying a thing for so long that they no longer recognize it as a weight, and the setting down of it is only understood in retrospect, once the hands are already empty. In the weeks that followed, investigators would re-examine the case file and find the record's error, and the story would attract attention in the way that stories of this kind sometimes do. People sharing and saying things in comment sections about miracles, and about the inadequacy of administrative systems, and about what animals know that we don't. Zola called on the first day and was crying so hard Merritt could barely understand her, and he sat on the kitchen floor and cried too, finally, with Shepard pressed against his leg, the dog's breathing slow and even and somehow ancient. But all of that came later. On the night itself, after the words had been said and the documents shown and the photograph held between two sets of hands in the yellow kitchen light, Merritt made 2 more cups of coffee, and they sat at the table, Shepard between them, the dog's chin resting on the young man's knee with the settled quality of something that had waited long. Enough and was now done waiting. The young man said he remembered the field. He said he didn't know if it was a real memory or something he had constructed from the photograph, but there was something in the shape of the light through the kitchen window that felt like a word he had been trying to remember for years and had finally found. He said he used to hum a song in the car. His adoptive mother had told him that once, years ago, that he would hum a song for the first few months, a small looping melody that had no words. She had asked him once where the song came from, and he had said he didn't know. Merritt asked him if he could hum it. He did. It was a song Merritt had made up for Caden when he was 3 years old. On a night when the boy couldn't sleep, and Merritt had sat on the edge of his bed and started making sounds with no plan, just following whatever the moment needed. It was not a real song. It had no name. It existed nowhere in the world, except in that boy's memory and in his own. Shepard raised his head when he heard it. He turned toward the young man's face. His tail moved once, slowly. Merritt could not say, could never say, whether that moment was a miracle or a coincidence, or simply the brain doing what brains do, pattern matching across 11 years of absence and return. He had stopped needing to say. He had learned that from the dog. Shepard died the following spring, on a Tuesday morning, 17 years old and slow and warm, on the rug in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the window that faced the backfield. Merritt and Caden were both there. The vet had been the night before, and the conversation had been gentle and final, and Merritt had called Caden, who drove up from the city where he was in his first year of college, and they had sat together through the night, the way you sit with someone who has held something for a very long time and is finally allowed to set it down. In the morning, when it was over, Caden picked up the collar. He turned it over in his hands. The tag was a simple metal disc, standard, with the dog's name and a phone number. But there was also a stitched label on the inside of the collar, the kind of label meant for kennels and boarding facilities, the kind with the owner's name. Merritt's name was there, printed in letters that had faded over the years to near invisible. But above the name, in the field for the pet's name, there were 2 lines. The printed line said Shepard. Above it, in handwriting that Merritt did not recognize, and then did, a child's handwriting, the careful and enormous handwriting of a 7-year-old who had learned to write not long before and was still making each letter with total attention. Someone had written a second name, mine. Caden pressed the collar to his chest and stood very still in the kitchen doorway with the morning light behind him. And Merritt watched his son hold the one thing in the world that had spent 11 years waiting to be held again. And neither of them said anything, because there was nothing in language that was equal to that.